A very good morning to everyone. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So, we will start the day with the personality of the day. Today, we'll be talking about Gunjan Saxena. So, she is very popularly called as the Kargil girl, and recently, you must have seen that a new series is being launched on Netflix, uh, say, the name being the Kargil girl. So it's about the journey of Gunjan Saxena. She was basically born in a family of soldiers where both her father and her brother were a part of the Indian army. So ever since she was a child, she always wanted to become a pilot. So then after her graduation, when she joined the college, and then she completed her training as a pilot, and then she was searching for a job. Her first posting of her career was in Udhampur in Jammu Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh. She was serving in those regions. So at that time, she narrates an incident where she says that in the Udhampur unit there was no basic things also. For instance, there was no separate washroom or a separate changing room for women there. But after she and the other woman went there, it soon changed. So that was the condition when she had joined the field posting. And she's popularly, as I said, is known as a Kargil girl. So she participated in the Kargil war in 1999, where she flew the cheetah helicopter through the hostile mountain terrain there. And her the job that she did was to supply the medical evacuation, then spotting the Pakistani positions, and then rescuing the Indian and injured soldiers in the war. So she brilliantly performed her job in the Kargil's Operation Vijay, and she became the first Indian woman pilot of the Indian Air Force to ever do so. So, in recognition of her services, she was also honored with the Shaurya Chakra Award. So, all of this shows that there is no end for what you can do in your life if you really want and if you are really determined to do. So, women can make mark in those areas which are said that it is very difficult or where women are not encouraged to take part. So, if she can dream it, she can do it. So, that is what it is. So, you can use this as an example in various essays on women and ethics, that women should get the equal opportunity, and the organizations should be sensitive, and they should have a work culture that is very conducive for the women to participate in such conditions. So in all these things you can use this example. Now we will start with the first topic of the day, which is doping in sports. So basically, this whole thing is important from the point of view of ethics. So you can expect, or you can even give such examples in ethics, even if you don't have a full-fledged question. So what happened here is Gomati Marimuthu, who had won even gold in the Asian Championships. Now she has been tested positive for a banned substance twice. So first of all, this shows that sport has become so competitive that people are not hesitant to use unethical means to win the games. And secondly, this shows how the spirit of sportsmanship has been spoiled because of these incidences. And thirdly, sport is always meant to develop that camaraderie and between the players. So here this whole spirit is now getting violated, and also it is very unethical if you look at this from the point of view of the other players who had participated in these events. So they missed a chance to win the medal because of an unethical player. So you are by adopting this unethical means, we are unethically taking away the opportunity from the other players also, who could have had a chance to win a medal in the sport. So this is one thing. And one more thing is this temptation, why people yield to this temptation to cheat in the sports. That is because if you see the government jobs or even promotions or even heavy cash prizes, these are all announced whenever a sports person wins a medal in a national international game. So people yield to these temptations, and in order to win these great jobs, government jobs, promotions, and heavy cash prizes, they yield to this temptation and they perform these they do this unethical work which should not be done. So these are some of the ethical issues which this is giving rise to. So you can use that as an example depending upon the question and the ethical paper. So next we will see an analysis of the G7. We have already discussed the basics of G7 the other day, that initially it was the G8 with Russia in it, but later on Russia was removed from this group when Russia annexed Crimea. And recently the G7 summit was to be held in the month of June, but because of the COVID crisis it has now been postponed till September, which could again definitely be postponed. And in this context, US President Donald Trump has also told that G7 has become an outdated concept, and now we should not have G7, but rather we should have what is called as G11, that would comprise even the emerging and developing countries like India, China, and Russia, back again, Turkey, and these countries. So in this context, what we discussed was, should we when Donald Trump invited that India should be part of this and there should be a G11, so should we really join this G11, or how is it? So is G7 itself very efficient and successful so that we can think about joining the G11? So that is what we will be looking at today. So first, before that, we will look at the basics of G7, like when it emerged. So it actually emerged as a restricted club of rich democratic countries in the 1970s. So in the 1973, there was the Arab-Israel War. So after the Arab-Israel War, the OPEC members, they ended up imposing an embargo against United States, Canada, Japan. So these are oil producing exporting countries, and they imposed an embargo against United States, Japan, Canada, and other countries. So it was then that it was thought that these countries should meet together, and it ultimately gave rise to the formation of G8. So when we consider about G8 now, we will see if the G8 or the G7 now, had it been was it effective in the past, so as to decide whether such groupings will be effective for India to join. So in the first case, the first most important thing that we'll talk about is the importance of the G7 economies then and now. So when the G7 countries were constituted, they accounted for nearly 2/3 of the global GDP. And now, according to the accountancy firm PwC, the world in 2020, so it released a report called as the world in 2050. So according to this report, by 2050, these G7 countries will comprise of less than 1/3 of the global GDP on a purchasing power parity basis. So this shows the declining importance of a grouping like the G7. And but if you look at the emerging economies, or which we call as the E7, emerging economies comprising of Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, and Turkey. So if you look at these emerging economies, their GDP is already now more than the 1/3 of the global GDP. So which means that the importance of these emerging economies is only going to increase in the future. And also the PwC has even projected that India's GDP will increase to $17 trillion by 2030, and it will be $42 trillion in 2050 in the PPP terms. So these emerging economies importance is going to be more in the future, and that of the G7 developed countries importance is going to be it's going to fall in the future. The second way of analyzing the effectiveness of any grouping is, it will be judged whether they have addressed the core global and the regional challenges of those times. So if you look at the economic slowdown, that the recession that happened in 2008, 9 and all that, so the G7 failed, the G7 countries may fail in recovering quickly from these economic slowdown of 8, 9. So after 7, 8, the economic downturn started, and later on it gave rise to the G20. So the G7, that was that time nowhere talked about, rather G20 gained importance because it gained the confidence of countries, and by promoting open markets and preventing the collapse of the global financial institution. And the third way of looking at the effectiveness of the institutions is whether how successfully they have dealt with the contemporary issues. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic now, the climate change earlier, the challenge of the Islamic State, and all of these challenges, how these countries have dealt with. So these countries, the G7 groupings have also failed in all these regards also. So if you talk about climate change, then if we say climate change, then the G7 countries account for nearly 60% of the historic carbon dioxide emissions at the global level. So that is their amount of carbon dioxide emissions at the global level, which means they have not contributed much to the dealing with climate change also. And yesterday itself, while we were discussing about climate change, we discussed that how these developed countries had pledged that they would be giving $100 million for the developing countries to undertake projects for adaptation and mitigation for climate change. But this too, they have not kept up the promise, and they have not given $100 billion every year to these countries. So the second thing that we spoke after climate change is regarding the Islamic State terrorism. So if you look at the top 10 countries which have contributed volunteers to the Islamic State, you will find that nearly 20,000 to 30,000 foreign fighters, just the countries in the G7 like France, Germany, and UK have themselves sent the these many number of Islamic State terrorists. That much they have contributed. So this means it shows that even this global menace of terrorism could also not be controlled by these countries. So this is one more thing. And the third thing is the G7 countries. Um, the this was a third that we discussed, how to analyze the effectiveness of G7, that how it was relevant for handling the contemporary issues. The fourth way of looking at the effectiveness of G7 is, does it stand with its own ideals? So the developed countries always followed these principles of the liberal Western values, where there is more liberal movement of people and values and all that. But if you look at the Europe now, so there is an inward looking tendencies. Because of liberal movement, there was a lot of migration, and there was so much of backlash against the migrants who are taking up the employment opportunities which were meant for the uh, people of the particular nation. So because of which the Brexit like tendencies are seen, which are against migration of people into the European countries, and who are demanding jobs in that region. So now the basic ideals based on which these Western countries had started progressing, that is the liberal Western values, now even these values are being questioned. So that is the fourth way that we have analyzed the effectiveness of the G7 countries. So in this context, how effective is this grouping for India if India is called to join in the future, as Donald Trump has now spoken about the G11? So G7, and we have analyzed how these groupings they fail to realize the goal for which they have usually been formed. So in this context, what should be India's approach? So first is that we need a international mechanism where the international trade is protected, the various challenges which all the countries in the globe are facing, the climate change, pandemic, all of these are dealt with, and the liberal values do persist because the exchange of goods and technology will continue in the future also. And even if we talk of public health, then the vaccine or the treatment that is found in one part of the globe should percolate to all the countries in the globe. Trade has to happen in a sustainable way. The inequalities among the nations will pose a big challenge, so this will also have to be bridged. And as far as India is concerned, its other priorities should be to reduce the menace of terrorism. There has to be the focus on issues like counter terrorism. And also, we have to focus on the effective immediate implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention. So biological weapons convention is now very important, given the potential these microorganisms or viruses have. If recombinant technologies are used, then life threatening viruses can also be lab designed. So because of this, another important area where at the international level the country should work in the future is the implementation of biological weapons convention. So these are the important points which India should remember to go forward. With this, we'll go to the next topic, which is issues and the policy formulation. So this is basically a small issue wherein we have this act of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So now an ordinance has been introduced. In this ordinance, the section 10A has been inserted. So what it says is, now because of the COVID crisis and the lockdown, several of the companies and firms, they have not been able to conduct any business. So they may have taken some loans from the banks or financial institutions or any other creditors, but now because they don't have business, they will not be able to pay back this money. So, because they are unable to pay back this money, these creditors have every right to initiate insolvency proceedings against these uh, companies. But, however, this is a very special and a very different circumstance where, because of the COVID crisis, they are unable to conduct their economic activities and pay back their debts. So, by inserting Section 10A of in the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act, so what is being now told is that there has to be no insolvency proceedings against any firm or a company or anything. Any corporate insolvency process should not be initiated for a period of 6 months starting from 25th March. So why this? So this is a good thing, right? That if any company or any entity has defaulted on the repayment of debts starting from 25th March 2020, then no such insolvency proceedings can be initiated against them for a period of 6 months now, that is till September 25th. And if the government wants, it can be extended for another 6 months after September 25th also. So the issue, however, in this is that the first thing is that supposing if any company becomes insolvent on 24th of March, so then it will not be considered under this case because it is giving an arbitrary date of 25th March 2020, and this cannot be said to be the date for the onset of the COVID crisis in India. That is one thing. And second thing is, during this period of the COVID crisis starting from March 25th, every case of default is assumed to be the default because of COVID crisis. That may not be the case. So if some person who decides to stop paying the debt just simply because all the firms who don't pay debts in this period are getting an immunity, then it will be wrong, right? Because the that entity has defaulted not because of COVID there was no economic activity. That entity has defaulted just like that. So in what this the issue regarding policy formulation is that in this case, any firm that defaults on the repayment of debt and for whatever reasons, not just because of COVID, for whatever reasons, insolvency proceedings will not be started against that particular entity. So this is an issue in policy formulation that we will need to focus. So which means that policy formulation has to be more scientific, more objective, it has to be more deliberated, and the interests balanced before a policy is formulated. So even in this, particularly in PubAd, we study what is called as the policy cycle. So in this policy formulation also there are several issues. We say our laws are not implemented properly, because for proper implementation of the laws it has to be properly formulated. So when the formulation itself is faulty, then definitely the implementation will also not happen effectively. So this is one of the reasons for lack of effective implementation of laws, that the policies formulated themselves are not scientific. So next is regarding the GM crops issue. So in this, there was nothing much in this article, but it just says that one thing that you should know is Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee is the apex body in India which will allow the commercial release of the genetically modified crops. So in India, there is already BT cotton. BT brinjal was also introduced, but the Supreme Court has put a moratorium on its mass commercial use. And but however, in spite of such bans, and in spite of many environmentalists telling that it will have a catastrophic influence on the environment and it will lead to a reduction in the biodiversity, but still farmers are using the BT cotton, and now HT cotton has also come, that is herbicide tolerant cotton has also come. So why herbicide tolerant cotton? Even when it is not approved, farmers want to use it and they are already planting it. Reason being that if it is herbicide tolerant, then they need not spray a lot of pesticides and herbicides and all. They need not spray. So this will make it very easier for the farmers to cultivate the crop, and for them the costs involved in the cultivation of the crop will also reduce. So because of all this, even those crops, even those genetically modified crops which are not actually approved for cultivation, are also now being cultivated by the farmers. So this is the issue regarding this. And so that was the only thing in this. So we will today, the question I'll be giving you is on GM crops. So this is an important issue, but then there was not much in the article. So let us finish off the topic. So now we'll be discussing yesterday's question. The question was, what is transparency and accountability, and what is its significance for a civil servant? So, in this case, you have to remember that even if the question is asking what is transparency and accountability, you don't have to give a very technical definition for that. You just have to write what is your basic understanding about it. For example, transparency is nothing but being open about whatever you're doing. So, transparency is just availability of information to the public so that they can see and know how the government is functioning. That is the essence of transparency. Similarly, what is accountability? Accountability is a combination of answerability and enforceability. That means whenever I am performing some function as a public servant, as a civil servant, then I am being called to answer that why I have performed such and such a function, what powers I have used. So, answerability is being called upon to explain why some action was taken. And enforceability is when it is known that some action was taken without the requisite powers, or it has exceeded the powers, it has misused the powers, it has caused undue harm to the public, then some action will be taken on the civil servant. That is enforceability. So, accountability is just a combination of answerability and enforceability. So, this forms the starting two paragraphs about the definition of transparency and accountability. Then you will have to go on to explain the significance to a civil servant. The first thing is, whenever there is transparency and accountability, there will be more trust. So, trust of the citizens is very important for the government to have, because we have a social contract. There is a kind of social contract between the government and the citizens, and this ensuring that the citizens trust the government is very important. The second thing is, it helps in people participation. So, and for these, whenever you're writing the dimensions, you can start giving examples in each of these dimensions. So, in people's participation, you can say that in the Swachh Bharat mission or in community policing. So, the participation of people component is there. For example, the national afforestation policy. So, in that, the people have to be there has to be a session with the people where they are consulted. So, in all these things, it is very important to have public participation, and transparency and accountability will just aid that. And remember, public participation or the people participation is also an important pillar of the good governance, or the CRAP tree, which I had spoken in the earlier videos. So, CRAP tree is the 8 pillars of the good governance. So, this was the mnemonic that we had created. The third is it ensures that there is a citizen-centric governance. For instance, the social auditing in the midday meal scheme, in MG Narega scheme. So this will make the whole thing more transparent, and the concerned authorities will be accountable for any issue. And through these social audits, the schemes are also going to be citizen-centric. The fourth is that it will also increase the objectivity of the administration, and it will reduce the scope of discretion. So, when a lot of information is put out in the open, then it is not possible to exercise the powers in a very discretionary manner. Rather, it will be in an objective manner, just what is given in the law, and nothing more, nothing less. So, that will be the this thing. For instance, in the e-governance tools. So, various e-governance programs are there which reduces the discretion of the authorities. So next is such transparency will check the misuse or abuse of the powers. So it will lead to reduction in the instances of corruption also. So for that, you can quote Citizens Charter, Right to Information Act, and all that. And next, you can write that such transparency will help actually in avoiding any social disruption, chaos, and unrest among the people. So it imparts even more political stability. If you look at the Arab Spring, where there was lack of accountability on part of the rulers and lack of transparency as to what the government is doing, so this led the people to protest on the streets. So this social chaos and unrest will be avoided if there is more transparency and accountability. So overall, it is that it will lead to a happy public. So you know that as Kautilya also mentioned in Arthashastra, it is the happiness of the king lies in the happiness of the subjects. So such transparency and accountability will help uh, in overall satisfaction among the populace. So that will lead to good governance. And in ethics answer, whenever you are writing something, you can also sprinkle some quotes here and there. You should not overdo it, but in a limited quantity you can use that. For example, if you're writing about transparency, you can say sun just like sunrise is the best disinfectant, or the sunshine is the best disinfectant, it is said. So that is a quote that goes with transparency. Similarly, accountability, you can say Lord Acton's quote of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. So these are all the quotes which can be very helpful in these answering these questions. But don't overdo. Don't write too many quotes in one answer. Just one or two here and there is good. So today's question is, analyze the role of GM crops in ensuring food security in India. It's a 10-mark question for 150 words. Today there wasn't much articles both in Express and in Hindu. So we'll see you soon on Monday morning. Yeah, take care till then. Study well. Bye bye.